It's interesting to me that even 110 years after Titanic sank, there is a lot of debate and discussion in terms of what caused this disaster. So in this video, I'm going to talk about what I feel are the top 5 reasons that led to not only the ship sinking, but to the tremendous loss of life on that cold, dark April night in 1912. Beginning with speed, the velocity or rate that Titanic was traveling at the time of impact was above 22 nautical miles per hour. The amount of time that you have when you see the iceberg and try to turn to avoid it is related to this. The slower you are going, the more time you have to avoid the iceberg. Thus, you can possibly turn and evade the iceberg entirely, or you can hit it in a manner that's less destructive. If you're going a little slower, the impact energy is less and the ship does take less damage. Perhaps your ship sinks, but it sinks much slower, so on and so forth. So now we talk about poor communication and its relation to the cause of the disaster. The SS Masaba sent an ice warning to Titanic about an hour and a half before the collision. And for whatever reason, this message allegedly just never got to the bridge. And if it did go to the bridge as it should have, and the officers knew, then they would have taken measures to slow down likely and alter course. So they would have just evaded the ice field entirely. There was also a wireless communication sent by the Californian, which was a ship that was about 20 miles away from Titanic when it sank, saying that they were stopped and completely surrounded by ice. The wireless operator Jack Phillips of Titanic told the Californian to keep out, and they were busy working passenger messages. So there's a problem here in that the prioritization of the wireless operators, who were not White Star employees, they work for the Marconi Company, their priority is passenger messages. In theory, they are supposed to prioritize things like iceberg warnings, distress calls, and other critical information, and not passenger messages. The conflict of interest here is that if you're prioritizing passenger messages and thus ignoring ice warnings, eventually if your ship strikes an iceberg, you can't send any messages at all because you are dead and your ship is on the bottom of the ocean. So the fact that potentially a message detailing what little Timmy had for dinner that's being sent to St. John, Newfoundland, or wherever is taking priority over iceberg warnings is slightly problematic, in my opinion. Can also speak about 4th Officer Joseph Boxhall of Titanic and the distress rocket conundrum. So, based on maritime standards of 1912 and earlier, distress signals, whether it's a rocket, gunshot, explosion, whatever, at night, are supposed to be sent up in 1-minute intervals. And Joseph Boxhall admitted at the British Inquiry that he was sending these distress rockets up at about 5 to 6 minute intervals. And thus the Californian, for many additional reasons, who knows what the truth is, but one of their arguments is that the Californian didn't respond and come to help the Titanic was because the distress signals just didn't really tell the story, and they claim they didn't understand that Titanic was in trouble. The ship's officers, in my opinion, are guilty of poor communication as well. Based on testimonies which all sort of contradict each other, ice warnings were not discussed, they were not properly posted in the chart room as they were supposed to be, and the general respect given to the ice warnings and this enormous ice field that was pretty much directly in Titanic's course the entire time, and just nobody really cared too much and they just maintained speed, actually increasing speed, is beyond negligent in my opinion. And they should have given the icebergs and the ice warnings more respect. They should have reduced speed, and they should have further diverted course south where there are less icebergs and this ice field does not exist. Moving on now to the abysmal lifeboat loading process. So, Titanic's 20 lifeboats could have held about 1,200 men safely. The crew of Titanic launched these boats. They actually launched 18 of 20 with about 670 people on it. So that's a ratio of approximately 57%, which is quite terrible. You could have loaded more than 500 more people into these lifeboats. And they didn't, for a variety of reasons. There was plenty of eyewitness testimony stating that the crew that were loading the lifeboats and launching them didn't really know how to use the davits. They didn't really know what they were doing. A lot of them were getting, I guess you could call it, on-the-job training. at 1:30 in the morning in pitch darkness where it's so loud at times that you can't even speak to someone standing right next to you. So it's not exactly the best time to learn how to do this. So that obviously slowed the process. The crew also had really no idea how many people they could even put into each lifeboat because they weren't sure of the weight that the falls, the davits, and the lifeboat itself could take. So that obviously is a cause for concern. You're not going to put 60 people in a lifeboat if you don't think it can hold 60 people. There's also the lack of urgency on the crew because, again, poor communication. Most people, and seemingly everyone except for a handful of people, didn't even know that Titanic was going to sink. And just by the behavior that you read about in testimonies and books, the general consensus is that people didn't know or didn't think Titanic was going to sink as fast as it did. And this is obviously problematic. And the crew, ultimately, the captain, is responsible. I mean, even if it's going to cause a panic, which is, you would think that this is why they're not going to tell people the ship is sinking. They want to avoid a panic, but you need to get people into lifeboats. You need to load these boats to capacity, and you need to get them launched. Because if you know the ship is sinking, and you only have a couple hours, and the captain knew approximately what time Titanic is going to sink, by the way, and still, the lifeboats were not loaded to capacity, and not even all of them were even launched successfully. So ultimately, this comes down to poor training, which I consider a lack of communication or poor communication. So they needed to do a better job in terms of getting the lifeboats launched. So now we move on to good old darkness, which has been a thorn in humanity's backside since the beginning of mankind. Darkness basically makes everything more difficult. If you can't see, you can't really do much. So it was a moonless, clear night. Thus, the only lights that are available are from the stars and from the lights on Titanic's decks. So, unlike in the movies, which portray everything to be very well lit and illuminated for cinematic purposes, the reality is that Titanic's decks were quite dark. So this makes loading lifeboats very difficult because you just simply can't see. And it is a manual process, and the process would be a lot easier if it were daylight. The second part of darkness is that, obviously, it makes the iceberg much more difficult to see. An iceberg of this size on a moonless night, it's estimated that you'd be able to see it within about half a mile to a mile of the distance it is away from the ship, but it's obviously this is dependent on a lot of things, light being reflected off the ice, the eyesight of the person that's looking at it, so on and so forth, the angle and shape also. But the point is, the darker the night and the fact there is no moon is going to make the berg much harder to see, and you're going to have a lot less time to evade it. So this obviously is hugely problematic because no one will argue that they wouldn't have been able to avoid this iceberg if it were daylight. So the fact that it was nighttime and it was just a dark night really made the situation a lot more hazardous. And finally, the number one cause of the Titanic disaster, drumroll please, was the presence of an ice field, which contained icebergs. There was really nothing special about the iceberg or ice fields that sank the Titanic. It's not uncommon for icebergs to be at that location at that time of year. The icebergs in the vicinity were not abnormally large as well, and the iceberg that Titanic struck most likely, based on testimony, was nothing more than a medium-sized iceberg per the International Ice Patrol's classification of icebergs. There's also the fact that the icebergs and the time of year being April makes the ocean water extremely cold, and that killed a lot of people after the ship sinks. Obviously, if Titanic sinks but the water is even 10 degrees warmer, it would have made a considerable difference in terms of the casualty rate, and perhaps a few hundred extra people can survive. If the water temperature is doubled what it was, maybe 65, 70 degrees in that region, then people could survive in the water much, much longer, and it would have given Carpathia more time to get there and rescue more people. So those are my top 5 causes of the disaster. Some other, I guess, honorable mentions that you see all the time, or that I see all the time, are brittle steel or poor steel used for the hull, as well as the wrought iron rivets were of bad quality. Steels that are made today are better. They're stronger, they're tougher, harder, so on and so forth, and they're just mechanically superior, as well as the rivets. But I don't really think that the ship could have really been made or built much better than it was, or designed much better than it was. And I think this is evident in that Titanic's oldest sister, Olympic, had a very successful career despite having incidents of collisions. And when she was scrapped, she was in quite good condition despite her many years of service, in addition to serving in World War I, where she actually rammed a German submarine and sank it. So this ship had its fair share of incidents and still had a successful career. I think it's also evident in the sense that White Star went out of business. They were the operator and owner of the Titanic, and Harland and Wolff, who was the shipbuilder of Titanic and Olympic and Britannic, so on and so forth, are still in business. So in terms of assigning blame, I would say Harland and Wolff is nowhere near as responsible for this disaster as White Star is. And I do think Captain Smith is, in terms of just one person who's responsible for this disaster, I put him at the top. I'm not condemning this man. I'm not saying he's an evil person or a bad person. Ultimately, he is or was legally, morally, and ethically responsible for everyone on board of that ship. He knew that there was ice there, or potentially that there was ice there at the very least. I think he was a little overconfident, and at the end of the day, I think he took a gamble, and he lost. And he ended up paying for it with his life and with the lives of nearly 1,500 other people. I think if there is such a thing as a tormented soul, I would think that Captain Edward John Smith's is probably one of the most tormented souls in the history of mankind. So, again, this is my opinion, and that's it. Thanks for watching.